fed a living Griffin for 12 years. Then the German authorities found out what they did next will terrify you. The recent deaths in Berchtesgaden weren't from bears. Those serrated wounds, that pattern of attack, I documented identical marks for over a decade. Now, military exclusion zones are appearing across the Alps, and I know why. 2009. A creature that shouldn't exist collapsed near my veterinary clinic during a blizzard. Bronze feathers that conducted electricity. A hybrid of eagle and mountain lion. Eyes that held intelligence equal to our own. 12 years of secrets. Fresh kills at dawn. Ancient artifacts appearing on my examination table. Roman coins. Medieval weapons from impossible altitudes. The creature was teaching me something. Showing me evidence of a civilization that's existed alongside humans for millennia. Then, their drone crashed. The electromagnetic field brought it down. Within hours, an agency that doesn't officially exist surrounded my property with equipment I'd never seen. They already had one in captivity. What I witnessed in their underground facility, the breeding programs, the experiments, the creatures are fleeing their ancestral territories now. If the German government's containment has failed, if something's gone wrong after 70 years of hiding these beings, what exactly is loose in those mountains? I need you to understand something before I begin. What I'm about to tell you cost me everything. My career, my home, my freedom to speak about what really happens in those mountains. My name isn't important anymore. The German authorities made sure of that when they erased 30 years of veterinary service with a single document. Call me Werner. It's close enough to who I used to be. I'm recording this from a small apartment in Zurich, speaking quietly because even here, 3 years later, I don't trust that I'm not being monitored. The only reason I'm breaking my silence now is because people are dying. Last month, a family of hikers was found near Berchtesgaden, their wounds matching patterns I documented for 12 years. The official report blamed a rabid bear. There are no bears in that region anymore. Haven't been for a decade, but I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand that I was a skeptic once too. 30 years as a wildlife veterinarian in the Bavarian Alps teaches you that nature has explanations for everything. Strange wounds, territorial disputes, unusual behaviors, disease, or environmental stress. Missing livestock? We have wolves again, despite what the farmers want to believe. I had explanations for everything until November of 2009, when an injured golden eagle changed the trajectory of my life forever. My clinic sat 12 kilometers from the nearest village, a converted farmhouse I'd bought after my divorce. The isolation suited me. Most of my work involved traveling to farms for large animal calls, but I maintained a surgery for wildlife rehabilitation. The eagle had been brought in by a hunter who'd found it thrashing in the forest, clearly losing a fight with something. The wounds were wrong. I knew this immediately, but couldn't articulate why. 43 puncture marks across the eagle's breast and back, each one serrated like a bread knife had been twisted on entry. The spacing suggested talons, but no European raptor has that kind of serration. More disturbing were the traces of saliva in the wounds when I ran the samples through the university lab I still had access to. The results came back corrupted. 3 times I ran those tests. 3 times the machine returned an error message about conflicting genetic markers. I documented everything with the precision that 3 decades of practice had ingrained in me. Wound depth, 17 to 23 millimeters. Spacing, consistent with a grip span of 38 centimeters. The saliva contained both avian, mammalian proteins, which should have been impossible. I preserved tissue samples in the freezer, labeling them with the clinical detachment that let me pretend this was just another medical curiosity. The hunter who brought in the eagle mentioned something I dismissed at the time. His sheep had been disappearing for months, not killed and partially eaten like wolf predation, but gone entirely. No blood, no drag marks, just absence. Like something carried them off, he'd said, making a lifting gesture with his hands. I told him eagles couldn't carry sheep. He gave me a look that suggested he knew that already. That was 3 weeks before the storm. 3 weeks of normal life, treating horses with colic and cows with mastitis, driving the winding mountain roads I knew by heart. 3 weeks of those tissue samples sitting in my freezer while something watched my clinic from the forest. I know it was watching because I found the tracks later, after everything changed. They'd been circling my property for days, studying my routines, learning when I was alone. The night of November 23rd, the worst storm in 20 years hit the Alps. Power lines came down across 3 cantons. My generator kicked on automatically, but I went to check the shed anyway, a habit from years of rural living. That's when I found it, collapsed beside the building, and understood that everything I thought I knew about the natural world was incomplete. The security light mounted on the generator shed had failed, leaving only my heavy-duty mag light to cut through the driving snow. The beam caught something that shouldn't have been there, a mound of what looked like burnished bronze metal sheeting tangled in the snowdrift. My first thought was that a hang glider had crashed, some thrill-seeker who'd gotten caught in the storm's leading edge. I'd seen it before, tourists who didn't respect the mountain's ability to create their own weather. I waded through knee-deep snow, already composing the emergency call in my head. The mountain rescue number was programmed into my satellite phone. But as I got closer, the bronze surface shifted, individual segments lifting and settling with labored breathing. Not metal, feathers. Feathers that caught my flashlight beam and threw it back in colors that shouldn't exist, copper bleeding into gold, gold shifting to deep amber. The anatomy made no sense. The wing clearly broken at an angle that made my veterinary instincts wince, stretched at least 4 meters. But this wasn't a bird's wing attached to a bird's body. The front limbs were structured more like arms, muscled and ending in digits that terminated in curved talons. The hindquarters belonged to something else entirely, powerful haunches covered in shorter bronze fur, legs that bent like a great cat's. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, snow building up on my shoulders, trying to make what I was seeing fit into any taxonomic category I knew. Griffin. The word came unbidden from some childhood book of mythology. But this wasn't mythology bleeding from obvious wounds. Its breathing irregular and labored. This was a living creature in critical distress, and 30 years of training overrode the impossibility of what I was looking at. My hand found the carotid area by instinct, if it even had a carotid. The pulse hammered against my fingers, but irregularly. 40 beats per minute, then nothing for 15 seconds, then 200 beats in rapid succession. The body temperature fluctuated wildly under my palm, burning hot enough to melt the accumulated snow, then dropping to barely above freezing. No creature I knew could survive such extremes. The wing break was compound, bone visible through the torn flesh. But the bone itself looked wrong, too dense, with an almost metallic sheen where my flashlight hit the exposed surface. I'd need my large animal surgical kit to even attempt setting it. The smart thing would have been to leave it, let nature take its course. No one would have known. But when I started to step back, its eye opened. Vertical pupil, like a cat's, but set in an eye the size of my fist. The iris was gold, shot through with veins of copper, and behind that gold was an intelligence that looked at me with full awareness. Not the panic of an injured animal, not the glazed confusion of shock, but a calculated assessment. It knew what I was. It was deciding what to do about me. We stayed frozen like that for maybe 10 heartbeats, the storm howling around us. Then, the eye closed, and the creature's body went limp. Unconscious, or choosing to appear, so I couldn't tell. But the decision was made for me then. I couldn't leave it to freeze to death, not when it had looked at me with such terrible clarity. Moving, it took every piece of equipment I had. The travois I used for injured sheep, reinforced with fence posts. A winch system usually reserved for pulling vehicles from ditches. The creature had to weigh at least 200 kilograms, despite the hollow bone structure I could feel through its flesh. It took me 2 hours to get it into the barn, my back screaming, my hands numb despite the thick gloves. The barn had been converted for large animal surgery years ago, steel operating table, overhead lights on a generator circuit, climate control for recovery. I'd operated on everything from horses to wild boar in that space. But as I looked at the creature laid out under the surgical lights, I realized I was about to cross a line there would be no coming back from. I drew 3 cc's of ketamine, the dose I'd use for a male red deer. The creature's breathing didn't change when I administered it. I doubled the dose. Nothing. Whatever this thing was, conventional anesthetics were not going to work normally. I'd have to set that wing with the creature potentially aware of every moment. The surgery took 6 hours. 6 hours of me working on anatomy that shouldn't exist, using techniques I was inventing as I went. The wing bone, if you could even call it bone, required my largest orthopedic pins, the ones I kept for bull fractures. Even then, I had to use a surgical drill meant for equine procedures just to penetrate the surface. The material felt like trying to drill through titanium wrapped in organic tissue. Without proper anesthesia, I expected the creature to thrash, to fight, to do something. Instead, it lay perfectly still, only the occasional twitch of its talons indicating awareness. Those talons, by the way, could have opened me from throat to groin with a single swipe. Each one measured 12 centimeters, serrated like steak knives along the inner edge. The creature knew this. I knew this. We both understood the position we were in. The most unnerving part was its breathing. It would stop entirely for 3, 4, sometimes 5 minutes. The first time it happened, I reached for my stethoscope, certain it had died on my table. Then the chest would expand again, a deep inhalation that seemed to pull all the air from the room. During those breathing pauses, my equipment would work normally. The moment respiration resumed, every electronic device would start showing interference. My digital thermometer displayed impossible readings, 43 degrees Celsius one moment, 17 the next. The EKG I'd hooked up produced patterns that looked more like seismic readings than heartbeats. When I finished setting the wing, I stepped back and really looked at what was on my table. In proper surgical lighting, the impossibility of it was even more pronounced. The feathers weren't just bronze-colored, they contained actual metallic elements that caught and reflected light like polished copper. The musculature was wrong for flight by any conventional understanding. Too heavy, too dense. This thing should not have been able to get airborne. Yet the wear patterns on its talons and the development of its flight muscles suggested it spent significant time in the air. Its eyes opened again as I was wrapping the wing. Both of them this time. The intelligence there was unmistakable. But there was something else, too. Amusement? It's hard to describe the expression of a creature with a face that was part eagle, part something else entirely. But I swear it looked entertained by my efforts, like a professor watching a student fumble through a problem they'd already solved. I heard its voice for the first time then. Not a screech or a cry, but a dual-toned vocalization that came from somewhere deep in its chest. 2 distinct notes played simultaneously, harmonizing in a way that made my teeth ache and caused the surgical lights to flicker. Every piece of electronic equipment in the barn shut down. The EKG flatlined, the monitors went dark, even my digital watch stopped working. Only the analog clock on the wall kept ticking, and even that seemed to stutter. "I'm trying to help you," I said, feeling foolish for speaking to it but needing to fill the sudden silence. "The wing will need at least 6 weeks to heal. You can't fly until then." It tilted its head, a gesture so bird-like it was almost familiar, except for the calculation behind it. Then it vocalized again, softer this time, just 2 short notes. The lights came back on. The equipment resumed functioning, though the readings remained erratic. I spent the next 3 hours installing security measures, telling myself it was for the creature's safety. Industrial locks on the barn doors, reinforced hinges designed for psychiatric facilities. I'd treated a security consultant's horses and he owed me favors. Motion sensors on the exterior, though those would prove useless later. As I worked, the creature watched me with those impossible eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was memorizing everything I did. The first week established patterns that would define the next 12 years of my life. The creature refused all food for the first 3 days. I tried everything: raw beef, chicken, fish, even road-killed deer I'd found fresh on the mountain pass. It would sniff each offering with what seemed like polite interest, then turn away. By day 4, I was genuinely worried. Most raptors could go a week without eating, but this creature's metabolism was unlike anything in my veterinary texts. On the morning of day 5, I found a rabbit in my trapline, still warm, barely dead. I brought it to the barn, more out of desperation than hope. The creature's entire demeanor changed. It sat up, and I use that term deliberately because its movement was more human than avian and made a low, trilling sound I hadn't heard before. When I set the rabbit down, it didn't immediately feed. Instead, it arranged the carcass with deliberate precision, positioning it just so before beginning to eat with a fastidiousness that was almost ritualistic. From then on, fresh kills only, nothing that had been dead more than an hour. I had to adjust my entire routine, checking traps at dawn, sometimes hunting myself when the traps came up empty. The expense was considerable: rabbits, pheasants, occasionally young deer. My freezer became useless. This creature demanded its food essentially still alive, and I found myself accommodating its preferences without really questioning why. The intelligence it displayed went beyond problem solving. By the end of week 2, I noticed it had been testing the barn structure systematically, not frantically throwing itself against walls like a panicked animal, but applying calculated pressure to specific points: the door hinges, the window latches, the spots where the walls met the foundation. It was mapping weaknesses, and it wanted me to know it was doing so. Each morning, I'd find small scratches at different structural points, marks that said I could leave if I wanted to. Yet it stayed. The vocalizations became more frequent and more varied. That dual-tone voice could produce sounds that ranged from almost musical to frequencies that made my bones ache. My digital recorder couldn't capture them properly. Playback produced only static and occasional mechanical screaming that damaged the speakers. I started keeping written logs instead, developing my own notation system for sounds that had no parallel in any animal I knew. The creature watched me write these notes with obvious interest. One morning, I came in to find my pen had been moved, placed precisely parallel to my notebook, which had been opened to the previous day's entry. Nothing was disturbed, nothing damaged, just that subtle acknowledgement, I see what you're doing. By week 3, the healing rate of the wing was defying everything I knew about bone regeneration. X-rays were impossible. The electromagnetic interference destroyed the images, but manual examination showed the fracture knitting at roughly 3 times the rate of normal avian healing. The creature would extend the wing partially during these examinations, watching my face as I palpated the injury site, seeming to gauge my reactions. The first time it made a sound that approximated German was the 20th day. I had been speaking to it regularly, partly to fill the silence, partly because I'd started believing it understood. Morgan, I'd say each morning. Good morning. Time to check the wing. That morning, as I entered the barn, it produced a sound that wasn't quite Morgan, but was clearly an attempt at the word. The dual-tone quality made it sound like 2 voices trying to speak in unison. One pitched high, one low, creating an effect that raised every hair on my arms. "You're trying to speak," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. It tilted its head and made the sound again, closer this time to the actual word. Then it did something that stopped my heart for a moment. It laughed. Not a human laugh, but unmistakably laughter. A rhythmic huffing accompanied by what I can only describe as amusement in its eyes. That's when I understood I wasn't just harboring an undiscovered species. I was dealing with something that might be as intelligent as me, possibly more so, and it was learning. The night I forgot to lock the outer barn door remains one of the most significant moments of those 12 years. It was late January, 6 weeks after I'd found the creature. I'd been called out for an emergency, a horse with severe colic at a farm 20 kilometers away. The surgery ran until 3 in the morning. When I returned, exhausted and running on autopilot, I secured the inner door but somehow missed the outer latch. I discovered my mistake at dawn when I came to check on the creature. The outer door stood slightly ajar. Fresh snow drifted against the threshold. My heart hammered as I pushed inside, certain I'd find an empty barn. But there it was, exactly where I'd left it, watching me, with those copper gold eyes that seemed to hold amusement. It had arranged things while I was gone. My surgical instruments, which I'd left scattered on the work table after treating the horse, were now laid out in perfect order by size. Scalpels to the left, forceps in the middle, sutures to the right. More unnervingly, it had drawn in the dirt floor geometric patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols within symbols, each line carved with mathematical precision. "You could have left," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature tilted its head and produced a sound I hadn't heard before, soft, almost melodic, lacking the usual dual-tone quality. Then it did something that stopped me cold. It pointed. Not randomly, but deliberately, using one of those terrible talons to indicate the corner where I kept my medical journals. The gesture was unmistakably human in its intent. I retrieved the journals, hands trembling slightly. The creature watched as I opened the most recent one, then made another gesture, a circling motion with its talon. Turn the page. I did, finding my notes from the previous week where I'd sketched its wing structure. It leaned forward, studying my drawings with obvious interest, occasionally making small vocalizations that sounded almost like commentary. That's when I began speaking to it regularly. Not just the occasional comment, but actual conversation. I'd describe what I was doing, explain my veterinary procedures, even discuss my concerns about keeping it hidden. The creature never responded with words, but its vocalizations became increasingly specific to different topics. A low trill when I mentioned the weather, a sharp dual-tone chirp when I brought up food, a complex harmony when I discussed its recovery progress. By February, the wing had healed to the point where the creature could extend it fully. The span was magnificent, nearly 5 meters, tip to tip, those bronze feathers catching the barn's fluorescent lights like hammered metal. It would exercise the wing in slow, controlled movements, never attempting actual flight, in the confined space. The discipline it showed was remarkable. Any normal bird would have battered itself against the walls trying to escape by now. The electromagnetic interference had become predictable. Whenever the creature was agitated or particularly focused, electronics would fail. But I noticed something else. It could control this effect. When I needed to use my equipment, it would go still, almost meditative, and the interference would stop. It was accommodating me, actively suppressing whatever field it naturally generated. One morning in late February, I found something that changed my understanding entirely. The creature had been drawing again in the dirt, but this time the patterns included something recognizable, a rough map of the local mountains. It had marked specific locations with symbols, including one that clearly represented my clinic. Other marks indicated places I didn't know, high valleys and peaks that weren't on any trail maps. It had been mapping its territory, and it was showing me. There are others, aren't there? I asked, studying the markings. Others like you. The creature made a sound I can only describe as confirmation. A long, low note that resonated in my chest. Then it added more marks to the map, indicating movement patterns, seasonal changes maybe. It was teaching me, sharing information no human had ever been privileged to receive. And I knew then that this creature hadn't stayed because it couldn't leave. It had chosen to stay, chosen to trust me with knowledge that could destroy its entire species if revealed to the wrong people. The weight of that responsibility would keep me awake for many nights to come. 3 months into our arrangement, everything changed. The gifts started appearing in March, as the worst of winter began to ease. I'd arrive at the barn to find objects placed carefully on my work. Table things that shouldn't exist at that altitude, in those mountains, or sometimes in that century. The first was a Roman coin, authentic by every measure I could determine without raising suspicions. It bore the image of Marcus Aurelius, worn but clear, the kind of artifact that would make an archaeologist's career. The creature had placed it precisely in the center of my notebook, impossible to miss. When I picked it up, still cold from wherever it had been stored, the creature made a soft trilling sound that I'd come to recognize as satisfaction. A week later, a spear tip appeared, medieval by its design, the metal still sharp despite obvious age. Then came fragments of armor, pieces of pottery, a carved bone that looked Celtic. Each gift was presented with ceremony, always centered on my workspace, always accompanied by that same satisfied trill when I examined them. The implications were staggering. These creatures had been here for centuries, maybe millennia, collecting and preserving human artifacts from throughout history. But why? What possible use could they have for these objects? I started researching, carefully, using my university library access from the computer in the village internet cafe. I couldn't risk searches from my home computer, not when I didn't know who might be monitoring. What I found sent chills down my spine. Medieval manuscripts from the monastery at Etal, 30 kilometers from my clinic, contained references to Die Bronzejäger, the Bronze Hunters. Accounts from the plague years described winged creatures that would circle battlefields but never descended until the fighting was over, collecting items from the dead. The monks considered them psychopomps, guides for souls, neither angels nor demons, but something between. A 15th century text included a sketch that made my hands shake. Crude but unmistakable, the same hybrid anatomy, the same distinctive head shape, even an attempt to show the bronze coloration with limited artistic tools. The accompanying text was in Latin, warning that these creatures should never be trapped or caged, that they would bring catastrophe to any who tried to possess them. "How long have your kind been here?" I asked the creature that evening. It responded by drawing in the dirt again, this time creating what looked like a timeline. Hash marks grouped in patterns I recognized as years, decades, centuries. The line went back farther than I could calculate, disappearing into the corner of the barn where it had run out of space. My research became an obsession, but I had to be careful. At the university library, I could feel eyes on me. A colleague, Dr. Friedrich Engel from the biology department, noticed my interest in historical texts. "Since when does a veterinarian care about medieval bestiaries?" he asked, trying to sound casual but clearly curious. "Just a hobby," I replied, closing the manuscript perhaps too quickly. "You know how it is, living alone in the mountains. You develop odd interests." He nodded, but I caught him watching me as I left. From then on, I was more careful, only accessing texts during busy periods, mixing my real research with innocuous veterinary journals. But the pattern was clear. Across centuries of documentation, something had been living in these mountains alongside humans for longer than anyone imagined. The creature seemed to understand my research efforts. It began bringing different types of gifts: photographs from the early 1900s, military badges from World War II, a child's toy from the 1800s. Each object was perfectly preserved, as if time worked differently wherever they were stored. By April, the creature would come close enough for me to touch its feathers. The sensation was extraordinary, like touching living metal that somehow remained soft and warm. The first time I made contact, a shock ran up my arm, not painful but electric, leaving my palm tingling for hours. The creature seemed pleased by my reaction, producing a harmonious sound that made every piece of glass in the barn vibrate. But it was also during this time that it began showing signs of restlessness. Despite our bond, despite the trust we'd built, it was still a wild creature with instincts and needs I couldn't fully understand. It would pace the barn at night, its talons clicking against the concrete in rhythms that seemed almost like language. Something was calling it back to the mountains, and I knew our strange partnership would soon be tested. The creature disappeared on April 15th, 2011. I'd known it was coming. The restlessness had been building for weeks, the way it would stand at the barn door and vocalize toward the mountains in frequencies that made my bones ache. When I arrived that morning to find the barn empty, I wasn't surprised, but the absence hit me harder than expected. For over a year, my life had revolved around this impossible secret, and suddenly I was alone with it. I told myself it was for the best. The creature had healed, had returned to where it belonged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our story wasn't over. I kept the barn locked but ready, fresh straw in the corner where it had nested, the examination table clean and waiting. Every morning for 6 weeks, I checked for signs of its return. Every morning, I found nothing but my own footprints in the dust. Then, on May 28th, I heard that distinctive dual-tone call echoing from the forest behind my property. Not one voice, but two, harmonizing in patterns that made my dental fillings vibrate. I grabbed my flashlight even though it was midday and ran toward the sound, my heart hammering with equal parts excitement and apprehension. They were waiting in the clearing where I'd first found the injured one. My creature, I could tell by a distinctive notch in one tail feather, stood beside. Another, slightly smaller, with darker bronze plumage that shifted toward copper in the sunlight. The female's eyes were different, amber instead of gold, and they tracked my every movement with sharp intelligence mixed with deep suspicion. The male, my former patient, made a soft trilling sound I recognized as greeting. But when I stepped forward, the female spread one wing in a clear blocking gesture, her talons flexing against the forest floor. The message was unmistakable. I was allowed to observe, not approach. They communicated between themselves in vocalizations I'd never heard before, complex patterns that rose and fell like conversation. The male would gesture toward me occasionally, producing sounds that seemed explanatory. The female would respond with what felt like questions, her head tilting to examine me from different angles. I stood perfectly still for 20 minutes, being evaluated by something that could tear me apart in seconds. Finally, the female seemed to reach a decision. She didn't approach, but her aggressive posture relaxed slightly. The male moved toward me then, not all the way, but close enough that I could see the fully healed wing, strong and perfect. It made a sound I'd learned meant food, and gestured toward the barn. "You want to use the barn?" I asked, feeling slightly absurd but knowing they understood. "Both of you?" The male produced that approximation of Morgan it had learned, then added new sounds, complex and urgent. The female watched my reaction intently. Something in their manner made me understand this wasn't just about shelter. They needed help. I prepared the barn that afternoon, doubling everything: 2 examination areas, 2 feeding stations, twice the fresh straw. When they arrived at dusk, I saw why they'd returned. The female was injured, not obviously, but favoring her left rear leg in a way that suggested deep muscle damage. She'd been hiding it well, but the male had known she needed medical attention. "I'll need to examine her," I said to the male, who positioned himself between us, not threatening but clearly mediating. "She needs to trust me, or this won't work." What followed was the most delicate negotiation of my veterinary career. Every movement had to be telegraphed, every tool shown to both creatures before use. The female never relaxed, her talons always positioned to strike, but she allowed me to palpate the injury-deep tissue damage, possibly from a territorial fight with another predator or another Griffin. That thought chilled me. If they fought among themselves, if there were territorial disputes, then there was a population. Not just a mated pair, but enough creatures to have conflicts, hierarchies, breeding competition. The implications were staggering. Documenting creatures that seemed to generate electromagnetic interference became my greatest challenge and my most important work. Every photograph I took of them came out, distorted, not blurred exactly, but wrong, as if the light itself bent differently around their bodies. Digital cameras would simply shut down when pointed at them. Film cameras produced images that looked like double exposures, showing the creatures but also showing through them, as if they existed partially outside normal space. Video was even worse. The files would corrupt immediately, sometimes taking the entire memory card with them. I went through 6 cameras in 3 years before giving up on digital entirely. Audio recordings captured only static, with occasional sounds that, when played back, damaged the speakers with frequencies they weren't designed to handle. But I'm a scientist by training, and I refused to let these obstacles stop me. I developed workarounds, methods that would have seemed absurd in any other context, but were necessary here. Detailed sketches became my primary documentation method. I'd always been decent at anatomical drawing. Veterinary school requires it, but I became obsessive about accuracy. Every feather, every scale pattern on their talons, the way their musculature shifted when they moved. The plaster casts were more successful. Their tracks, pressed deep into mud after rain, held their shape perfectly when cast. 4 toes forward, 1 back, like a raptor, but with a pad behind the talons that was distinctly feline. The size varied. The male's prints measured 38 centimeters from back talon to front, the female's 31 centimeters. I made dozens of casts, storing them in the old root cellar where I kept potatoes. The feathers were the most remarkable evidence. When shed naturally, they maintained their unusual properties, that bronze sheen that shifted color, the metallic quality that wasn't quite metal. Under microscopic examination, the structure defied explanation. The barbules were interwoven with what looked like metallic threads, actual metal somehow grown as part of the organic structure. When I tested one at the university lab, sneaking in after hours, using equipment I technically no longer had access to, I discovered something that made my hands shake. The feather contained elements that shouldn't exist in biological material. Traces of rare earth metals, structures that resembled carbon nanotubes but were clearly organic in origin. The keratin itself was unlike any I'd seen, dense enough to stop a knife blade, yet flexible enough to enable flight. I ran the test 3 times, each time getting results that shouldn't be possible. I couldn't publish any of this, couldn't even discuss it with colleagues. Who would believe me? A veterinarian claiming to have discovered creatures from mythology, living in his barn, demonstrating intelligence equal to or greater than human, I'd be discredited, institutionalized maybe, and worse, it would put the creatures at risk. So I kept meticulous private records, notebooks filled with observations, behavioral patterns, vocalizations I'd assigned meanings to through repeated context. The female, despite her initial wariness, began displaying remarkable problem-solving abilities. She figured out how to open the barn's interior latches by watching me do it twice. She could arrange objects in patterns that clearly had meaning, though what meaning I couldn't decipher. The male showed me more of their communication system. Those geometric patterns they drew weren't random. Certain symbols appeared repeatedly in specific contexts. A spiral when discussing weather, intersecting triangles when they seemed to be planning something, parallel lines when indicating danger or concern. It was clearly a form of writing, though whether symbolic or literal, I couldn't determine. I tested a hypothesis one evening by drawing my own pattern in the dirt, a simple circle with radiating lines, like a child's drawing of the sun. Both creatures became intensely interested, vocalizing rapidly between themselves. The male added to my drawing, turning it into something complex, a mandala of interconnected symbols. Then he looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for a response. "I don't understand," I said, frustrated by my inability to crack their code. "I'm trying, but I don't understand." The female made a sound that, I swear, was laughter. Not mocking, but genuinely amused by my efforts. She smoothed over the dirt with her tail and drew something simpler, just 3 marks. She pointed at herself, then at the male, then at me, touching each mark in turn. 1, 2, 3. Us. It was a breakthrough moment. They weren't just intelligent, they were trying to teach me, to bridge the communication gap from their side. And that's when I realized I wasn't studying them anymore. We were studying each other. By year 5, my carefully maintained secrecy began to crack. It started with hikers reporting strange sightings near the Wetterstein Mountains. Glimpses of huge birds that moved wrong, sounds that didn't match any known wildlife. A blogger from Munich picked up the stories, calling it Bavaria's Thunderbird mystery. The attention was exactly what I'd feared. The creatures sensed the danger before I did. They became agitated whenever strangers passed within 2 kilometers of the property, their vocalizations shifting to warning frequencies that made the windows rattle. The female would disappear for days, scouting the increasing human traffic. When she returned, she'd draw patterns in the dirt that I'd learned meant danger and many humans. I had to act fast. Using my veterinary connections, I spread counter-narratives. Yes, I'd treated several golden eagles, recently magnificent specimens, easily mistaken for something larger by untrained observers. The sounds, wind patterns in the mountain passes could create acoustic anomalies. I even staged a few sightings myself, releasing a rehabilitated eagle where hikers would see it, giving them a story to tell that fit within normal parameters. The closest call came in August of 2014. Hans Muller, the regional wildlife inspector, arrived without warning. His diesel Mercedes announced him from a kilometer away, usually plenty of time to secure everything. But that day, both creatures were in the barn, the female recovering from what I suspected was a territorial dispute with another of their kind. "Werner," Hans called out, checking his clipboard. "Routine inspection. We've had reports of unusual predation patterns." My mouth went dry. The creatures were awake, alert, only 10 meters from where Hans stood. One vocalization, one movement, and everything would be over. "Of course, Hans," I managed, stepping outside to meet him. "Though I should mention, I'm treating a highly aggressive wolf-dog hybrid in the barn. Sedated, but we should stay clear." He frowned. "Wolf dog? You need special permits for those." "Emergency treatment," I said quickly. "Owner's bringing. The papers tomorrow. Coffee first?" You look tired. For 3 hours, I kept Hans in my kitchen, discussing everything from local wildlife populations to his daughter's university applications. Every excuse I could manufacture to keep him from that barn. The creatures remained perfectly silent the entire time, displaying a discipline that still amazes me. They understood the danger as clearly as I did. When Hans finally left, citing other inspections to complete, I found both creatures positioned exactly where they'd been when he arrived. They hadn't moved a muscle in 3 hours. The female's eyes met mine, and in them I saw full understanding of what we'd just avoided, but the pressure was building. Amateur cryptozoologists started camping in the nearby forests with trail cameras and recording equipment. I'd find their devices and disable them, always making it look like weather damage or animal interference. I became an expert at misdirection, leading expeditions away from the plain-off creature's actual territory, fabricating evidence in the wrong places. The stress was destroying me. I lost 15 kilograms that year, stopped sleeping properly, became paranoid about every visitor. The creatures noticed. One morning, I found a gift different from their usual artifacts, a small pile of medicinal herbs, the kind that grew only above 3,000 meters, plants traditionally used for anxiety and insomnia. They were trying to take care of me, just as I cared for them. Years 7 through 10 brought an unexpected stability. The outside interest died down after a harsh winter with no new sightings. The creatures had adapted their movements, avoiding human contact with remarkable precision. They'd learned to read weather patterns that predicted human activity. Clear weekends meant more hikers, so they stayed hidden. Storm systems meant solitude, freedom to move. The trust between us had evolved into something I can only describe as friendship. The male would allow me to examine his wings without restraint, spreading them fully so I could check for parasites or injuries. He'd even demonstrated their hunting technique, using prey that was already dead, showing me how they used thermal updrafts to hover silently, how they could lock their wing joints to glide for hours without effort. The female, though never as comfortable with physical contact, shared different knowledge. She showed me cache sites where they stored artifacts, hidden chambers in the rock faces that humans would never find without knowing exactly where to look. Inside one cache, I discovered objects spanning 2,000 years of history. Roman coins, medieval weapons, World War I medals, a smartphone from 2012. They were historians, collecting evidence of human presence in their territory. Their behavioral patterns followed rhythms I slowly decoded, Peak activity during new moons when the darkness provided cover. Increased vocalizations 3 days. Before earthquakes, they could sense tectonic movements humans couldn't detect. During the full moon of each month, they would perform what I can only call a ritual, flying in complex patterns while vocalizing in harmonies that seemed to serve no practical purpose except perhaps joy. In 2018, I discovered evidence that changed everything. Small tracks in the mud near the barn, miniature versions of the adult prince, shed pin feathers, bronze but lighter, almost golden. The creatures had successfully bred. I never saw the offspring directly, the parents were far too protective for that. But the evidence was unmistakable. Restructured nesting materials in the barn's upper loft, arranged in a bowl shape lined with fur and feathers. Regurgitation marks suggesting feeding of young. The male began hunting more frequently, sometimes bringing back 2 or 3 rabbits daily. The female's behavior changed dramatically. She became fiercely territorial, even once, when I climbed toward the loft without thinking, she intercepted me with a scream that left my ears ringing for hours. The message was clear, there were boundaries even I couldn't cross. But they still trusted me with proximity to their young. I'd hear high-pitched versions of adult calls from the loft, see shadows of smaller wings learning to fly in the barn's rafters. The male would occasionally bring down shed juvenile feathers, placing them deliberately where I'd find them, sharing their offspring's development even if I couldn't witness it directly. By year 10, I documented behavioral patterns that suggested a complex social structure extending beyond our barn. Visitors other griffins would sometimes approach at night. I'd hear multiple voices in conversation, see heat signatures on my thermal camera that suggested gatherings of 4 or 5 individuals. They were part of a community, and my barn had become a safe haven, a place where they could gather without fear of human interference. The morning I found evidence of a second breeding pair using the barn, I realized I wasn't just protecting 2 creatures anymore. I was safeguarding an entire hidden population, a species that had survived alongside humans for millennia through intelligence, adaptation, and careful avoidance. The weight of that responsibility would soon be tested in ways I couldn't imagine. March 17th, 2021. That date is burned into my memory like a brand. I was preparing morning feed when I heard it, a high-pitched whine followed by complete silence. Not normal silence, but the absolute absence of sound that happens when every bird, every insect, every living thing freezes in response to danger. The drone crashed into my north field 40 seconds later. Military grade, that much was obvious from the size and construction. 4 rotors, each the span of my arm, cameras and sensors I couldn't identify. The unit was still sparking. When I reached it, circuits fried, battery compartment smoking. Whatever electromagnetic field the creatures generated had brought it down hard. I should have reported it immediately. That would have been the lawful thing, the smart thing. Instead, I dragged it into the tool shed and covered it with a tarp. Maybe I could claim I never saw it, that it crashed somewhere else. But even as I hid the evidence, I knew it was too late. This wasn't some hobbyist's toy that had wandered off course. Someone would come looking. They arrived 6 hours later. 3 black SUVs with government plates, moving fast up my access road. No sirens, no announcement. Just the crunch of gravel under heavy vehicles. I watched from my window as 8 people emerged, all wearing identical dark jackets with badges I couldn't read from that distance. The man who knocked on my door was maybe 50, gray-haired, carrying himself with military precision despite civilian clothes. His badge read Bundesamt für Spezielle Biologische Vorfälle, Federal Office for Special Biological Incidents. I'd never heard of such an agency. Herr Werner, he said, not asking. We're investigating systematic navigation failures in this area. Our equipment indicates strong electromagnetic anomalies centered on your property. I run medical equipment, I replied, keeping my voice steady. MRI machine for large animal diagnostics. It can interfere with electronics if not properly shielded. He smiled thinly. An MRI. In a barn. 12 kilometers from the nearest village. He consulted a tablet. Interesting that you've never registered such equipment with the relevant authorities. Behind him, his team was already spreading out, unpacking devices I recognized as electromagnetic field detectors, ground-penetrating radar, equipment that had no business in a routine investigation. 2 of them headed directly for my barn, as if they knew exactly where to look. We'll need to inspect your facilities, he continued. For safety compliance, you understand. Unregistered medical equipment poses risks. The creatures were in the barn, both of them, plus evidence of offspring. Feathers, tracks, 12 years of hidden life that would be exposed in seconds if those agents entered. I felt sweat running down my back despite the cool March air. Of course, I heard myself say, but I should mention I'm treating a rabid wolf in there, secured but extremely dangerous. I'll need to sedate it first for your safety. The team leader's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew I was stalling, but he nodded. 30 minutes. We'll wait. I walked to the barn as calmly as I could manage, feeling their eyes on me. Inside, both creatures were already alert, positioned defensively. The female's eyes met mine, and I saw understanding there. They'd heard everything. "You need to leave," I whispered urgently. "Now, take everything." The male made a low vocalization I'd never heard before, mournful, almost apologetic. Then both creatures began moving with incredible efficiency, gathering feathers, destroying evidence of nests, even smoothing out their tracks in the dirt. They worked like they'd rehearsed this evacuation 100 times. The investigation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. The team leader, who never gave his name beyond Herr Director, established a command post in my driveway. Equipment trucks arrived within hours, portable laboratories, communication arrays that suggested this was no simple compliance check. For the first week, they were almost polite about it. Questions about unusual wildlife sightings, requests to review my veterinary logs, interest in my electricity usage patterns. They found my hidden sketches within 2 days. I'd been foolish to think the well house was secure. The director studied them with intense interest, but said nothing about the impossible anatomy they depicted. "Interesting artistic hobby," was all he said, photographing each sketch with a specialized camera. The warrant arrived on day 10, comprehensive enough to allow them access to everything. Financial records showing my veterinary supply purchases, far more than a single practitioner would need. Satellite imagery of my property showing heat signatures that didn't match any normal structure. They even had customs records of biological samples I'd sent to a colleague in Prague for analysis 3 years earlier. "These genetic markers," the director said, showing me a printout of data I recognized. "They match samples recovered from 12 other sites across the Alpine region, sites where unusual predation events occurred." The creatures had vanished the night of the first inspection, but their absence didn't make things easier. Without them there, every sound made me jump. Were they safe? Had they been captured elsewhere? The female had been preparing to lay eggs. The stress of fleeing could have killed her. The investigators worked in shifts, maintaining 24-hour surveillance. They mapped every centimeter of my property with ground-penetrating radar, finding cache sites I didn't even know existed. Ancient bones arranged in patterns, metal objects sorted by age and origin, evidence of intelligence that couldn't be explained away. On day 15, they brought in a specialist, Dr. Christina Lehman, according to her badge, though something about her suggested that wasn't her real name. She examined the barn with equipment I'd never seen before, devices that measured something she called biological electromagnetic signatures. "How long?" she asked me quietly when we were alone. "How long have they been using this structure?" I said nothing, but she nodded as if I'd answered. "The resonance patterns suggest at least a decade," she continued. "Maybe more. The electromagnetic scarring in the wood is extensive." She turned to face me fully. "You know what they are, don't you?" "I don't know. What you mean?" She smiled sadly. "Herr Werner, we have recordings from 317 encounters over the past 70 years. We have tissue samples, feather specimens, even partial skeletal remains from a specimen killed in an avalanche in 1953. What we don't have is a living subject. Until now. My blood ran cold. I don't." "They're gone, aren't they?" she interrupted. "You warned them somehow. That's unfortunate. For both of us." The questioning intensified after that. 12-hour sessions that felt more like interrogations. They showed me photographs, grainy images of creatures in flight, thermal footage of something large moving through mountain passes, even what looked like cave paintings from the Neolithic period, showing winged beings with dual nature. "These creatures have been here longer than human civilization," the director explained. "They've adapted to avoid us, learned to hide in plain sight. But someone has been protecting, feeding them, helping them breed." The female returned on day 20, alone, in the middle of the night. I heard her distress call through my bedroom window, a sound that made my chest ache with its desperation. They had the male. Somehow, they'd captured him, and she was begging for my help. but I was under constant surveillance. I could only listen as she called throughout the night, her vocalizations becoming increasingly frantic. By dawn, she was gone, and I knew I'd failed them both. They moved me at 4 a.m. on April 12th. No warning, just sudden lights flooding my bedroom, voices commanding me to dress quickly, pack only essentials. The temporary assessment facility turned out to be a repurposed military compound near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, all concrete walls and narrow windows that didn't open. They called it protective custody. I called it what it was, imprisonment. The interrogations began immediately, though they dressed them up as interviews and debriefings. Always the same windowless room, always the same fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. The director would sit across from me with folders of evidence I couldn't deny, my sketches, purchase records, the electromagnetic scarring doctor. Lehman had documented in the Barnes Wood. "We're not your enemy, Herr Werner," he said during our third session. "We're trying to understand what you've observed. These creatures, they're remarkable, aren't they?" I maintained my silence, but he continued as if I'd answered. 73 years we've been tracking them, he said, opening a folder filled with black and white photographs. Since 1948, when an Allied bomber crew reported bronze angels escorting their damaged aircraft through a storm over these mountains. The pilots swore these beings guided them to safety, showed them a pass that wasn't on any map. The photographs were grainy, but unmistakable. Wings, caught in searchlight beams. A figure perched on a cathedral spire in Munich, barely visible except for the bronze glint. Tracks in snow beside a measurement stick showing the same dimensions I'd documented. Every time we get close, they vanish, the director continued. They're learning, adapting to our technology. The electromagnetic interference they generate, it's not accidental, is it? They've evolved this defense mechanism specifically to counter human electronics. On day 12, they showed me satellite imagery that made my blood run cold. Thermal signatures across the entire Alpine region, concentrated in areas I recognized. The high valleys the creatures had marked on their dirt map. Nesting sites, meeting places, a whole hidden civilization existing parallel to our own. The government had been tracking them for decades, mapping their movements, studying their patterns. We estimate between 40 and 60 individuals across Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, Dr. Lehman explained during one session. Possibly more. They're intelligent enough to maintain separate territories, to avoid overlapping hunting grounds. They have social structures, hierarchies we're only beginning to understand. She showed me video footage from a military drone, recorded just weeks before the crash on my property. 2 creatures in flight, their bronze forms barely visible against the dawn sky. They moved in perfect synchronization, banking and diving as one, their wings creating patterns that looked almost like communication. They're not just animals, she said quietly, glancing at the director. There's something else. Something that challenges everything we think we know about evolution, about intelligence, about our place in the natural order. The polygraph tests were the worst. Questions about non-terrestrial biological entities that I didn't understand. Questions about contact with foreign governments, about selling biological samples, about things that had nothing to do with my 12 years protecting the creatures. They were looking for something bigger, some conspiracy I wasn't part of. Have you ever observed these creatures demonstrating technology beyond their apparent development level? Have you witnessed them interacting with human-made objects in ways suggesting prior knowledge? Do you believe these creatures originate from Earth? That last question made me laugh, bitter and sharp. Where else would they come from? The director and Dr. Lehman exchanged glances. That's what we're trying to determine, he said. Week after week, the questions continued. They brought in specialists, geneticists, evolutionary biologists, even a physicist who asked about the electromagnetic fields. Each one more convinced than the last that these creatures represented something unprecedented. Not just a new species, but evidence of parallel evolution, of intelligence developing along completely different lines from humanity. Meanwhile, I could only think about the female's desperate calls that last night, about the male who trusted me enough to stay when the door was open, who tried to teach me their language. Were they still alive? Had the female found safety? Had their offspring survived the trauma of sudden relocation? On my 78th day of detention, the director finally gave me an answer I'd been dreading. We have one in custody, he said simply. Would you like to see him? I knew it was him before they even opened the containment unit. That familiar bronze glint through the reinforced glass, the way he held his wings despite the confined space. They'd built him a cage that was more like a laboratory, white walls, LED panels simulating daylight, cameras recording every angle. The electromagnetic dampeners they'd installed made my skin crawl, a low-frequency hum that felt like pressure against my eardrums. The male Griffin looked smaller than I remembered. Not. Physically, he was the same magnificent creature who'd spent 12 years in my barn. But something in his posture, the way he held his head, suggested defeat. His eyes found mine through the observation window, and I saw recognition there, followed by something that might have been shame, as if he'd failed by being captured. "He won't eat, Doctor," Lehman said beside me. "It's been 6 weeks. We've tried everything, live prey, fresh kills, even specimens you documented in your notes. Nothing." I understood immediately. It wasn't about the food. It was about the ritual, the arrangement, the choice. They'd turned him into a test subject, and he was choosing the only resistance available to him. "Let me try," I heard myself say. The director shook his head. "Too dangerous. We don't know." "He's dying," I interrupted. "You can see it in his metabolic readings, can't you? The temperature fluctuations are increasing. His electromagnetic field is destabilizing. You'll lose him within days if something doesn't change." They debated for 3 hours before agreeing to let me enter the containment unit, but only under strict conditions. I had to wear a tracking device, stay within view of the cameras, make no attempt to damage the dampening equipment. Armed guards would be stationed outside, ready to intervene if the creature showed any aggression. When the door sealed behind me, the male raised his head slowly. Up close, I could see how much weight he'd lost. The bronze feathers had dulled, some falling out to reveal pale skin beneath. His breathing was labored, nothing like the controlled respiratory pauses I remembered. "I'm sorry," I whispered in German. "I'm so sorry." He made a soft vocalization, barely audible with the dampeners active. Not the dual-tone voice I knew, but a single, weak note. Then he did something that broke my heart. He attempted the approximation of Morgan he'd learned all those years ago. It came out distorted, fading, but unmistakable. I sat with him for 4 hours that first day, not trying to feed him, not conducting any examinations, just sitting. Sometimes talking quietly about nothing important, sometimes silent. The guards watched nervously as he shifted closer, finally resting his head near my leg. A gesture of trust that seemed to confuse everyone watching. When I returned to my quarters that night, I found a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement waiting for me. 37 pages of legal text that essentially erased my existence if I ever spoke about what I'd witnessed. My pension would be terminated, my veterinary license retroactively revoked. Any attempt to publicize or communicate about the subjects would result in prosecution under state secrets laws with a minimum sentence of 25 years. "Sign it and you can go home," the director said. "Refuse, and you'll remain here indefinitely as a security risk." "What about him?" I asked, gesturing toward the containment wing. "That's no longer your concern," I signed. What choice did I have? But as I packed my few belongings, Dr. Lehman slipped me a note. Just an address in Munich and a date 3 months in the future. When I looked up at her, she gave an almost imperceptible nod. They returned me to my property on a gray morning in early July. The barn stood empty, professionally cleaned of any evidence. No feathers, no tracks, no sign that impossible creatures had lived there for over a decade. Only when I went to collect my old veterinary tools did I find it a single bronze feather placed precisely on my examination table, positioned exactly where I used to leave my morning coffee. The female had been there. Despite the surveillance, despite the danger, she'd returned one last time to leave me a message, or maybe a goodbye. I picked up the feather, feeling that familiar electric tingle against my palm, and noticed something else. Tiny scratches on the metal table surface, arranged in a pattern I recognized. 3 parallel lines, the symbol they'd used for danger, followed by a spiral that meant weather or change, and finally, 2 intersecting circles. I'd seen that last symbol only once before, when the male had tried to explain something about their offspring. 2 circles, overlapping. Continuation. Future. They were telling me the young had survived. Somewhere in those mountains, a new generation of bronze hunters was learning to fly. 3 years have passed since I signed that agreement. 3 years of silence that ate at me like acid. I moved to Switzerland, changed my name, tried to forget. But you don't forget 12 years of impossible truth. You don't forget the trust in those golden eyes, or the sound of dual-toned voices trying to teach you their language. And you certainly don't forget when the evidence starts mounting that something has gone terribly wrong. It started with the news reports last month. Unknown predator kills 4 in Berchtesgaden National Park. The wounds, they said, suggested a large raptor, but no European bird could inflict such damage. I recognized the pattern immediately: 17 to 23 millimeter puncture depth, serrated edges, that distinctive spacing. But something was different. These attacks were aggressive, desperate. The creatures I knew killed cleanly for food. These deaths were defensive, territorial. Something was pushing them out of their normal ranges. Then came the military exclusion zones. No explanation, just suddenly large areas of the Alps declared off-limits for geological surveys. I recognized every location, the high valleys from their dirt map, the nesting sites I documented, the places where generations of bronze hunters had lived in secret. The government was moving in, and not for observation this time. Dr. Hoffman reached out to me 2 weeks ago. I'd heard about his death, of course, respected ornithologist, 40 years of experience, died in a climbing accident near Zugspitze. Except he'd sent me a package before he died, routed through 3 different countries, paid for in cash. Inside were his notes, his real findings, the database of sightings he'd compiled over 2 decades. They're farming them, his final entry read. Breeding programs in underground facilities, trying to replicate the electromagnetic effect for military applications. The creatures know. They're fleeing their ancestral territories. Population crash imminent. The female found me again 5 days ago. I don't know how I'd moved 3 times, used false names, paid everything in cash, but I woke to that familiar dual-tone call outside my window. She was thin, exhausted, one wing showing recent injury. When I opened the window, she dropped something on the sill and vanished into the pre-dawn darkness. It was a modern military dog tag, German armed forces, with a serial number that shouldn't exist, all zeros except for the final digit, 1, and wrapped around it, a small piece of paper with GPS coordinates written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Below the coordinates, a single word in English: help. I went to those coordinates yesterday. An abandoned Cold War bunker, supposedly sealed since 1991, but the locks were new, the security cameras modern but hastily disabled. Inside, I found evidence of a massacre. Bronze feathers scattered like autumn leaves, scratches on concrete walls spelling out patterns. I recognized their written language, desperate messages I could only partially decode, and blood, so much blood. But also something else. In the deepest chamber, hidden behind fallen equipment, 3 juveniles, barely fledged, their bronze feathers still soft with youth. They were terrified, hungry, but alive. The female had led me to them, trusted me one more time to protect what remained of her kind. I can't keep them, I know that. The authorities will find me eventually, they always do. But I can. Document this. Create a record that can't be destroyed, can't be classified. Someone needs to know that we had contact with something extraordinary, something that tried to coexist with us peacefully for millennia. And we destroyed it, as we destroy everything we don't understand. The young ones are adapting already, learning to suppress their electromagnetic fields completely. Evolution in real time, driven by desperate necessity. They'll survive, hidden deeper, trusting humans even less. But they'll remember this too, that one human tried to help, that their parents' trust wasn't entirely misplaced. If you're near the Alps, if you see bronze shadows against the dawn sky, if you hear harmonious cries that make your teeth ache, leave them alone. They've paid enough for our curiosity. They've lost enough to our need to possess and control everything we discover. The Griffins aren't myths, they're refugees now, survivors of humanity's oldest crime, the inability to share this world with anything we can't dominate. And somewhere in those mountains, the last free members of an ancient lineage are teaching their young to fear us, as they should.